Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Wednesday, August 7th.
I want them to admit, meaning upper management and the city, to admit to the racism that's going on.
Racial tensions in the city's water department are boiling over 2 years after a scathing report unveiled a rampant problem.
We have too many illegal guns in this city and too many people willing to use them. And that's why.
As the city grapples with a violent summer, local groups are collaborating to get to the root of the problem. A new report shows Chicago public schools may be shortchanging many students of classroom instruction, particularly African American and students with special needs. Our Spotlight Politics team on an indicted state senator keeping a leadership post and Mayor Lightfoot's reaction to national attention over Chicago's deadliest weekend.
Look at that. Beautiful. And it's
We ride along with the Chicago beekeeper whose unique business is buzzing this summer. Jeffrey Bear is here to investigate the story of how one Chicago neighborhood got its name.
We are very seldom seen.
And a new community garden aims to increase the visibility of Chicago's American Indians. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. Protect Our Park sees a new opening to stop the Obama Presidential Center from landing in Jackson Park. Amanda Vinicky has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Amanda.
Phil, it was case closed in district court after a judge in June dismissed Protect Our Parks lawsuit, clearing the way for construction to begin on the center. But then came a federal report late last month that found the Obama Center would have an adverse effect on historic Jackson Park. A motion filed today says that's highly relevant new material and cause to reopen the case. A hearing is set for Tuesday. Meanwhile, Protect Our Parks is pursuing a separate appeal. New developments tonight in the murder of the University of Illinois visiting scholar Ying Zhang. Thanks to an immunity agreement with the killer made with federal prosecutors last year, only now are Zhang's parents and the public learning more about what he did with her body. Brent Christensen told attorneys he kidnapped and murdered Zhang, then put her dismembered remains in several trash bags before putting them in the garbage. They likely went to a landfill, making chances for any recovery likely impossible. Zhang's father today called his daughter's killer heartless and evil. Our Matt Masterson has more on this story on our website. The Cook County Public Defender is calling on the Chicago Police Department to take down its new gun offender dashboard immediately. Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson unveiled the database Monday. It tracks all individuals charged with felony gun offenses and their bond status. Johnson and Mayor Lori Lightfoot say those charged with gun crimes are too often quickly and easily released back on city streets. Cook County Public Defender Amy Campanelli is pushing back, blasting the website as deeply troubling and misleading. Let's set the record straight, she says. The term gun offender also includes anyone who illegally possesses and doesn't shoot a gun for his or her own protection. Campanelli says the site is inaccurate about types of bonds. No immediate response from the CPD. Illinois' U.S. senators are crying foul about the danger of balls flying into the stands at Major League Baseball games. They've sent a letter to Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred urging the league to collect and report data on fan injuries. They say a registry would help evaluate safety measures and help families know where it's safest to sit. Transparency benefits everyone in making informed decisions and preserves the integrity of the game, the letter reads. The senators earlier asked Manfred to require all teams extend protective netting, as the White Sox were first in the league to do earlier this season. Walgreens will close 200 U.S. stores this fall as part of what it calls a cost management program. Which stores and how many will be in the Chicago area, the Deerfield-based company isn't saying. In a statement, Walgreens says it expects minimal disruption to customers, given that the closures represent less than 3% of its stores. They say most impacted employees will be offered jobs at other locations. Meanwhile, the owner of Sears and Kmart just announced it is closing more locations, including stores in Bloomingdale and Merrillville, Indiana. As for the weather, a chance of storms overnight, otherwise partly cloudy with a low around 69 degrees. Then tomorrow, sunny and a high near 84. Now, Phil, back to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Racial tensions are boiling over in the city's historically fraught Department of Water Management. This comes 2 years after a scathing Inspector General report found rampant racism, sexism, and even illegal gun dealing in the department. Then Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced a clean sweep. So why do some believe the problems have only been swept under the rug? Paris Schutz has the latest. Paris.
Phil, we talked to a former high-ranking water department employee today. We talked to a current employee today. They're unhappy with what's going on in the department, even under the new mayor. This high-ranking former water department employee is speaking out about what she says is still this culture of racism and sexism and a hostile work environment. Her name is Catherine Ely. She was a chief operating engineer. She left her job last month. She is one of 8 plaintiffs named in a lawsuit that was filed in 2017 that alleges this culture that is ongoing at the water department. She says she's been retaliated against and has been called every name in the book.
Besides being called a black bitch several times, besides being called an effing whore, I always have to fight to be included as an equal with the white male chiefs. I would always say, how come I can't get treated the same way as they do, you know, and things of that nature.
Phil, you mentioned house cleaning in 2017. Mayor Emanuel got rid of the then commissioner of the department, got rid of high-level managers there, installed a new commissioner, an African-American named Randy Connor, and then there was that damning Inspector General report that showed these terribly racist emails that were sent around to a lot of employees. But what Ms. Ely says is nothing has changed since that time.
Even under the new commissioner, they talked about a reset button, and as I said before, it's an ongoing joke at the plant that the reset button is broken. You know, blacks are still being mistreated. You know, nothing has changed.
So what's the latest with the lawsuit?
Well, it's still making its way through the courts. Phil, Ely's attorney says that the previous administration had held on to pertinent documents that he was seeking in this lawsuit. The city's law department responded by saying, quote, any claims that the city has not provided records are categorically false. The city has already produced more than 17,500 pages of documents. Last fall offered to provide plaintiffs' counsel access to employment records that would clearly demonstrate that race did not factor into promotions or unwarranted discipline. So here's the thing. These are the documents that the city has provided. Almost nothing there is unredacted. So there really is no information on any of those documents. And Ely's attorney says that he has fought this administration tooth and nail.
Expected the battle under, Mayor Rahm Emanuel because in part Barrett Murphy, the prior commissioner, was a friend of his, at least as reported in the newspapers. But we're hoping for a change. We're hoping that we don't have to fight each and every day for information. We just want them to be transparent, to be honest, to be straightforward, to be candid, and to let the chips fall where they may.
Paris, you mentioned that there are 8 named plaintiffs. Is that as far as the extent of allegations go emanating from those 8 folks? No,
Phil. Victor Henderson, the attorney, says that there are hundreds more that are unnamed that are part of this lawsuit who will attest to a rampant culture of racism and political cronyism. And Phil, this department has been and is a city office where many clouded employees land. There is another federal lawsuit that was filed earlier this year by a man named Dylan Abreu. He is alleging the same pattern of racism and retaliation against he and other members of the Latinx community. And we spoke with a current water department clerk who has been there 30+ years. She says she has just been unfairly put on paid leave, says she wants the new mayor to talk with employees like her who are still subject to what they call a torturous work environment.
We want her to come. We need her to talk to us. She needs to fire all these people because, first of all, it's by clout that a lot of these people are there. They don't know what they're doing, but they're getting paid to do the jobs, and they're disciplining anybody. Go to the water department and clean it out.
And we reached out to the water department today for comment. They declined, citing this ongoing litigation.
Paris, thank you. And up next, a group of Chicago institutions collaborating with 4 communities to find the root causes of gun violence.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
A local group is studying gun violence as a public health issue. Last weekend was the city's most violent of the year, with 59 people shot, 7 of them dead. The Chicago Gun Violence Research Collaborative, founded in 2016, is working with community members to examine gun violence and identify its direct causes. Joining us are Noam Ostrander, Associate Professor of Social Work at DePaul University and Director of the Chicago Gun Violence Research Collaborative, Alice Burgess, a medical student at Rush University who was a fellow for the Research Collaborative, and Terry Williams, a student in the University of Illinois Chicago's Master of Health program, who was also a fellow for the Collaborative. And welcome all to Chicago Tonight. Noam Ostrander, a little bit more. What exactly does the collective do?
Sure. So the collective came together in an attempt to see sort of how universities and hospitals could bring their resources together to work with communities to get at gun violence and understand the root causes and figure out ways that we can impact such a complex situation.
And as part of that effort, you've been engaged in research. Tell us what that research has been. You're a relatively new organization, but what kinds of things do you explore?
Sure. So a lot of the research has been carried out through qualitative efforts, whether it's been listening sessions or interviews that our fellows have done. And largely what that is, the purpose of that is to sort of build relationships and learn from the communities as to what they're experiencing.
So Alice and Terry, as part of this fellowship, there are 16 fellows, 6 faculty fellows. What motivated you, Terry, to want to be a fellow, to look into this situation?
Well, one, I was born and raised here in Chicago within the Inglewood community, so I've seen a lot of gun violence happen. Also, been in law enforcement for about 12 years now, and responding to those type of incidents, you want to do something more. So public health has seen gun violence and recognized gun violence as an issue and an epidemic. So us as fellows, we wanted to attack that.
Alice, what did you focus on in your research?
I did a range of things, but one thing that Terry and I focused on was being part of the fellows who are collecting interviews. So to date, I think the collaborative has done between 130 and 150 interviews over 2 years. And the idea of the collaborative is really just to change the definition of research. Typically, research can be quite extractive, with researchers going into communities and not really valuing the voices or having an ongoing relationship. So the idea of the collaborative is really to listen chiefly and really highlight all the assets that communities already have.
So, Noam, talk about some of the findings from your work regarding the causes of violence. What are you hearing from, first of all, who do you interview?
Sure. So we've been interviewing both people who are in the community as well as people who are working in organizations. And really, if possible, I'd like to turn that question to our fellows who've done most of the listening sessions and the interviews and have just some fantastic stories from their interviews.
Terry, what did you find out from conducting your research as far as insights that people give you as why they think gun violence is such an issue right now?
Yes, it's not a new issue. So us as fellows, we wanted to take a multi-level approach, looking at things on a community level and address things on an individual level. In public health, we call that the social ecological model. So us as fellows, we wanted to take it directly head on. I was actually having a discussion with my cousin last night, and he was saying that you can't go around the idea, you have to take it on directly. So that's us, what we had to do as fellows, is take it on directly.
So what did Alice Burgess, some of the things you found in your research as explaining or the underlying causes of gun violence itself?
One of the most meaningful interviews I got to do was with a violence interrupter who was incarcerated for a period of time and then returned to his community to really break the cycle of violence. And one of the things that he really emphasized was the need to invest in our youth. So in Chicago, a lot of the people who were talking to us kind of said that their youth aren't feeling valued in the communities and they're not getting those kind of opportunities. Yet we did talk to really amazing organizations in the communities who are doing this work to really empower the youth and change the cycle that we're seeing.
Another thing I understand that your research pointed to is that guns are viewed as sources of power and status symbols. Terry, can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about things on a psychological level, it's a culture, and we're not talking about the culture of it being a race culture. It's a culture of the neighborhood, a culture of the city. That guns are symbols. That we use those guns, you feel empowered when you have a gun in your hand, and when you have a youth who have no guidance within the community and they hold that gun, they feel empowered. So we have to change that psychological effect when it comes to our community of violence.
My understanding also that your research showed, Norm, maybe you can address this, is that there is an expectation among young people that at some point they're going to have a gun.
Sure. So somebody like Claude Steele did research on what's called stereotype effect, and I think largely what that is if this is what you expect of us, then this is what we will become. And I think with a lack of other opportunities or limited other opportunities, and as we've seen resources leave those communities, I think that it does become an expectation that this is sort of the direction.
Another finding had to do with the status of the nuclear family. Alice, can you address that?
Yeah, people in the interviews were kind of discussing how we're just seeing a lot of changes within society and culture. We're kind of seeing less of the shootings are directly related to gang violence, but people are also seeing the breakdown of institutions that typically were very strong, including the nuclear family and also church institutions.
Terry, can you give us some insight? You mentioned you're a Chicago native, that is, and that you grew up in the Englewood community. Mm-hmm. You alluded to the fact that there was violence in your community. Tell us about what your experience was like growing up.
Well, during my experience, I grew up where the gangs were being decentralized at that moment. So
there was a big push to crack down on gang leaders.
Correct, mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you will have a territory where it's just one gang, but it will be block by block, cliques. And that's the issue that I know the Chicago Police Department are dealing with. You're not just dealing with one gang in particular, you're dealing with each block by block. And that's pretty much how I grew up, particularly in Englewood. You'll have all these factions of gangs causing issues.
So, Noam, as one listens to this discussion, we're hearing lack of investment in Chicago's youth, guns being viewed as sources of status, issues regarding the nuclear family. These are issues that are not exactly new. They have been around a while. What revelations or what do you hope for your research to accomplish?
Sure. I think as we've been working with communities, the things that we've learned and the things that we already knew is that the communities have just rich sources of assets. They've got fantastic programs that are already going, but they lack some capacity, they lack some resources, and I think this is where the collaborative can have a big impact, right? So we can provide some capacity building so that organizations can demonstrate the success and the efficacy of their programs, which can lead to more funding, can lead to more publicity, but really there are fantastic programs already in the city, but we just don't hear about them.
Is there something that, Alice or Terry, is there something that surprised you in the work that you did? Any findings that you weren't expecting? Any insights that came as a bit of a revelation?
To be honest with you, nothing new. Again, these are issues that we've been dealing with for a long time now. But like Noam had mentioned, we discovered a lot of great assets. And when I say assets, I mean the people within these communities, the community-based organizations that's doing great things, the folks that's already studying gun violence like us. There's a lot of people that's doing great work that try to curb this issue that we have in Chicago. So we have to recognize them and give them the support that they need.
As you may know, yesterday the president alluded to video games and mental illness as potentially contributing factors. Alice Burgess, your reaction to those insights?
I think that those are really important insights, and I do think that a lot of the time, a lot of it is education too. So a lot of the people who are talking to us about the need for youth investment also saying it's a need for better Chicago public schools, for more investment. And I also would like to just touch upon Terry's previous point. I think one thing that people were really wanting is not necessarily that they don't have a voice. They already have a voice. They just need people to listen. And I think it's a very cool role that the healthcare institutions can play, is that you don't want your physicians and the public health advocates you have just to be kind of passive parts of this like larger system. You really want them to be your ally.
No, Ostrander, your take on the president's comments regarding video games and mental illness. Are those issues that are contributing here in Chicago?
You know, I would love to see investment in mental health. What we've seen in the city is the closing of community mental health centers. Anytime there's mass shootings or there's a conversation about guns, mental health is brought up, but there's never an investment in it. There are targeted investments that we could make in mental health that would have an impact on gun violence, but we don't have the will to do that either.
So what is your vision of the collaborative going forward? My understanding is, among other things, you might be recruiting community members as fellows. Tell me about that.
Absolutely. That is, I think that's sort of been part of our vision, is to start with sort of a small program that would have university fellows from across the city, and then bring in community fellows, which will really enhance all the work that we do. And then perhaps 2 years down the road, we'll try and bring in youth fellows as well to just add more voices. Really, I think that the value that we can bring, and that is unique to sort of our research activist model, is that we can decentralize and help build capacity within communities so that they can do this research. There are some great questions, there's some great solutions out in the community, and I've been doing this work for just under 20 years. Probably the best lesson that I learned is to be quiet and listen to the community.
Noam Ostrander, Alice Burgess, and Terry Williams, thank you all for being here. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so please stay with us.
Don't miss one of our stories. Get them all delivered to your desktop or mobile device with a subscription to the WTTW News Daily Briefing. Go to WTTW.com/dailybriefing and sign up.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, our Spotlight Politics team on an indicted state senator keeping a leadership post and more. We meet a Chicago beekeeper whose business model is buzzing this summer. Jeffrey Bear explores the history of a unique Chicago neighborhood on this week's Ask Jeffrey. The story behind a new urban garden and why it features Native American structures like a teepee on Chicago's North Side. But first, Brandis Friedman and an alarming new report about Chicago public schools. Brandis.
And Phil, each year, hundreds of Chicago public schools are having to make do without teachers and substitutes because of a teacher shortage. Some schools have had vacancies, including those for special education teachers, for a year or more. And according to new reporting from WBEZ, that shortfall does not impact all schools and students equally. Here now to tell us more is Sarah Karp, the WBEZ reporter and education specialist who, along with her colleague Paula Friedrich, broke this story. Sarah, good to have you here.
Good to have you too.
So you analyzed data. Explain, if you would, what you found when you looked at that data of teacher vacancies and substitute teacher requests.
So the first thing that I was doing was I was looking at substitute teachers, because I had heard people say, you know, it's really, really hard to get a sub, and my kid went to school and there was no sub today, and no teacher. And so I looked at the substitute teacher data, and one thing that I noticed there is that there were some schools that were requesting subs an awful lot, and I was wondering, you know, what's up with that? So then I went and looked at teacher vacancies, and I saw a correlation between schools that request a whole lot of subs and then schools that have teacher vacancies. And one thing about the sub data is that it showed that only about 70% of the time that schools ask for a sub do they get them. So a third of the time they say I need a sub, nobody shows up. This is far worse when you look at schools on the south sides, on the west sides. It's sort of mostly black students. They're getting subs, you know, maybe like some of them only half the time that they ask for them. And then when you look at teacher vacancies, there's 152 schools in Chicago. That's about a third of all the public schools in Chicago have had a year-long teacher vacancy last year. And this is not something that is unique to last year. You know, if I would have gone back and looked year over year, I probably would have found some of the same level of vacancies, though there might be a few more this last year because, as you probably remember, we've had budget cuts, and so when you cut positions, perhaps you have fewer vacancies because the positions aren't there. So.
And then when you when there's more money in the budget, basically, did principals begin to sort of open up more positions, increasing the number of vacancies, basically?
Right, and actually that's one thing that the HR guy for CPS said is that, you know, it's great to have position openings, but if you can't fill them, they mean absolutely nothing. And especially in schools where they were desperate for more staff and for more teachers, that they haven't been able to fill these positions means that they're not benefiting from the extra money that CPS has.
And you touched on it, but go a little deeper, if you would, about the disparity that you found for Black and Latino students in the schools that are predominantly Black and Latino versus those who are mostly white.
Sure. So one thing is that no majority white school, and there's only 28 in Chicago, have had a year-long teacher vacancy. You see sometimes they'll have a vacancy for a couple months, but none have had a year-long vacancy. However, you look at 99 schools that are majority Black have had a teacher vacancy, and about 45 that are majority Latino, and 8 that are mixed. So it's like, you know, 30%, 30%. So it's impacting majority Black schools more than any other schools. And part of that is that some schools are just not getting teacher candidates. Like, nobody's applying for the job. So they don't have anybody to hire. And why is that? Maybe because people think it's far away from where they live. Maybe they don't live in those neighborhoods. Maybe they think it's a difficult job because you're dealing with children who've experienced perhaps a lot of trauma, or, you know, are living in poverty, and that's a harder job. So why exactly people aren't applying for these jobs, I think there's a myriad of reasons, but the end result is that I talked to parents where they're like, my child didn't have a 6th grade math teacher for an entire year. I've talked to a bunch of high school students who were saying, you know, their sophomore English teacher left, they weren't able to replace that teacher for the entire year, left it in the fall, the whole year, no sophomore English. You know, just stories like that just make you think, like, what are we doing here?
And you also found a disproportionate impact on students who are in special education.
Right, and special education, nationwide, there's a shortage of special education teachers. Not a lot of people are going into special education. One special education teacher I talked to, she pointed out that, you know, there's sort of a misconception that all special education teachers are doing are like changing diapers, when that's not what they do at all. But these are teachers that are a lot of times in classrooms with regular teachers, providing support for children who have learning disabilities, who might have some behavioral issues, you know, keeping them focused. They know special ways of how to teach these students so that they get the instruction they need, and they can be on par with their peers. And without that, then they're, you know, sometimes they're just left floundering. They, you know, it's sort of, a lot of experts are saying this is where you start to see these kids get disengaged, because if they don't have a special education teacher with them, maybe they get disinterested. They start to think that they're a failure because they can't keep up. And then, you know, fast forward high school, they drop out, they're way behind. These having a teacher vacancy for 1 year can just last, from what I hear, a long time.
What's been the district's response to all of this?
Well, they say, yes, we're working on this. This is an issue. We want this to change. Part of what they say is there's a nationwide teacher shortage. This is how this plays out here. They have some programs to try to help schools that are hard to staff attract teachers, recruit teachers. they do things where they take, for this certain set of schools called opportunity schools, they will take candidates and they'll hire them even before they have a school placement, and then sort of play matchmaker between the candidate and the school. And that seems to be helping reduce vacancies, not eliminate them. So they are trying. I think that, you know, as they point out, this is a national issue, and Matt Lyons, who's the head of HR for CPS, he said, you know, here's the thing, like, you go to a rural school district and they are dealing with the same teacher shortage. They might have to hire 1-2 teachers a year. I've got to hire hundreds of teachers a year. It's a hard thing to find those teachers. And so ultimately, probably some of the solution lies in trying to get more people to go into teaching, more young people to go into teaching, and especially more Black and Latino people to go into teaching, young people to go into teaching, because research shows that they're more likely to be open to going to schools that are majority Black and majority Latino, and actually, you know, maybe they're more suited for those schools in some ways too. Some of them are more suited. So that's part of the solution.
We're almost out of time, but what's been CTU's response to this?
Well, they say there's some contract demands. You know, they're in the middle of contract negotiations.
Absolutely.
That there's some contract demands that could help this, including bringing more substitute teachers on staff full time. So right now they're paid by the day, and they'd say, you know, if they're on staff full time with benefits, then you'd have more, you know, leverage to direct them where to go. Maybe even make them part of some school staff so that they could slide into positions when a teacher's out.
Sarah Karp from WBEZ, good to have you here. Thank
Good
you.
to have you. Good to be here.
And now, Phil, back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. It's a job as old as time, but one Chicagoan is beekeeping in her own unique way. Here's Jay Shesky with her story.
It's a passion that's not for the faint of heart. But for graphic designer turned beekeeper Jana Kinsman, it's a labor of love.
So this is probably 60 pounds of honey.
60 pounds?
Yeah.
Kinsman was bitten by the beekeeping bug after taking a class at the Chicago Honey Co-op in 2011.
Look at that.
Beautiful.
She then did an apprenticeship with a beekeeper in Eugene, Oregon. And with that experience, she knew she wanted to bring her skills back to Chicago. Today, Kinsman is harvesting honey at the experimental station, which hosts the 61st Street Farmers Market. Kinsman has enlisted the help of Madeline Bordenko. She's one of the staffers at the experimental station, and this is her first time harvesting honey. Each box houses 9 frames that the bees use as their home base. They can fly up to 5 miles in their hunt for flower nectar.
Honey is concentrated flower nectar. So this hive has been growing and searching for flower nectar since we started it here in April.
Kinsman has about 40 hives around the city, as far south as Chatham and as far north as Pilsen.
So you go on the far side.
What makes this so remarkable is that the majority of her work is done by bicycle.
What are you doing?
There's a beehive back here. We just harvested about 120 pounds of honey.
But why by bike? The idea was hatched during her apprenticeship in Oregon.
And I made a joke, like, I'm going to do this when I go back to Chicago, but I'm going to do it on my bicycle since I don't own a car. And at that time, I wanted to just prove that you could do anything by bicycle.
On this day, Kinsman will bike her 120-pound load from the experimental station on 61st and Blackstone about 5.5 miles to her workshop in Chicago's Back of the Yards neighborhood. The plant is a former meat processing facility located in the vicinity of the old Union stockyards. It's been turned into this 93,000 square foot space for small food businesses. A successful Kickstarter campaign helped Kinsman launch Bike-a-Bee in 2012. She asked various community gardens to host her hives, and nearly all said yes, including here on the roof of the plant. But there was a steep learning curve during her first season.
It was a drought year, and the hives did not even make enough honey for them to survive the winter. So it was really difficult, and then the next spring I had to raise more money to keep the project going.
In addition to a few business roofs, Kinsman also has hives in public community gardens and urban farms. She bikes to all 40 hives every 7 to 10 days to make sure the queens are healthy, the hives haven't been vandalized, and to check whether it's time to harvest the honey. Back in her workshop, Kinsman scrapes off the wax cap that's holding the honey in place and saves it for candles and other products she's developing. After that, the honey-soaked frame is put into a centrifuge and spun in both directions to extract every drop. The golden liquid is then poured through a fine strainer to get out any debris.
I love to just sit down and at the end of the season just taste all of them back to back and kind of see how they compare.
Kinsman estimates that she'll harvest between 50 to 60 gallons of honey this summer. Despite the sweet benefits, beekeeping is serious business and isn't for everyone. But if you want to help bees flourish, Kinsman has a simple suggestion.
If you want to help bees, think more about how you can benefit all insects with your backyard. Planting native flowers, not spraying your lawns, letting the clover grow, letting the dandelions grow. Like that benefits all insects.
Kinsman has been stung over the years, but sees it as a minor hazard of the job, like biking in Chicago traffic.
I really love beekeeping and I love the animal husbandry of it, but my goal is to have that side of it kind of uplift the education efforts through community gardens to get more of Chicagoans engaged in nature and in bees.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Jay Shefsky.
By the way, no bees, camera operators, producers, or helpers were harmed in the filming of this piece. If you're interested in beekeeping, Jana Kinsman offers Bike-a-Bee apprenticeships between May and September. And if you're interested in her honey, that is, you can find it at the 61st Street Farmers Market, the Antique Taco Bridgeport Farmers Market, and also online. You can find all the information and more from our conversation with Jana Kinsman on our website. State Senator Tom Cullerton's fighting a federal indictment. He's charged with being a ghost payroller for the Teamsters Union. What does that mean for his career in state politics? And another embattled politician, Alderman Kerry Austin, shed some tears, plus pushback on the mayor's contention that gun offenders who shouldn't have been were released on bond. Talking about it all is our Spotlight Politics team of Amanda Vinicky and Paris Schutz. Carol is not with us tonight, but it's good to have the two of you. And so let's talk about Senator Tom Cullerton. Who is he and what's he accused of?
He is a state senator from Villa Park. He had previously served as the village's president. He also, Cullerton, familiar name, he is not the state Senate president. He is, you'll often seen him referred to as a distant relative or a distant cousin. In fact, I learned today he is the third cousin, once removed, of State Senate President John Cullerton from the storied political lineage of the Cullertons. What a third cousin once removed is. I heard this joke. I'm going to use it. I'm not Catholic, I'm not Irish, I don't quite know what that means. Right. Regardless, he is accused now of embezzlement. Basically, while working as a state senator, he was also collecting a paycheck from the Teamsters Union. He previously had been a union member himself. He was supposed to be an organizer, but it appeared he was doing no work whatsoever and got paid $188,000, basically bilking his fellow former union members, even though he did no work.
Here's what's interesting
according
about that
to the indictment.
According to the indictment, allegedly.
But it takes two to tango in an alleged scheme like that, and so allegedly someone at the union, perhaps John Coley, who was also indicted, set this nice little sweetheart deal up for Tom Cullerton, but Coley is not indicted on any charge related to that. And what this screams of here is the feds, you know, kind of trying to put the fear in politicians, saying we're going to get you on everything. And it's clear to me they want Cullerton to talk.
And that's the big question.
They want to know what he knows, because this is not. It seems like it's not the most serious charge, or someone else could have been charged with this, but they want him to talk. They want him to flip. They want him to turn.
Well, what do you get out of a sweetheart deal? Why would John Coley, who again has now pled guilty in a separate scheme related to Cinespace, but what on earth was he getting out of this from Senator Cullerton if, in fact, the Fed's allegations prove to be true? By the way, Cullerton's lawyers are fighting it. And there's another twist there, Phil,
yes.
and that is that Collerton's lawyer is married to Supreme Court Justice Tice. So you'll see
Mary
that
Jane
last name, Tice. There you go, Mary Jane Tice.
A lot of dots being connected.
Oh, yeah.
So what does
Family
his,
affair.
So what does his future in politics look like?
Well, it doesn't look like it's going to change at all, at least in the short term. He was taken down as head of the Labor Committee, obvious conflict of interest there. He was installed on the Veterans Affairs Committee. And the thing about these committees is you get a little bump in your salary. So his salary as a public official isn't going to change. And then it was revealed that John Collerton, his third cousin, once removed, was the one that put him on this new committee. So, you know, it seems kind of odd that, you know, you've got, in the case of Carrie Austin or in the case of Tom Collerton, they're being taken care of here. You know, there's a standard, there's a legal standard, innocent till proven guilty, but when you're a public official, that standard doesn't really apply. I mean, if you want to send a message that you're doing things the right way, you usually remove people who are under indictment or under a cloud like that.
Well, let's move on to an alderman who finds herself under intense scrutiny, and that is Alderman Carrie Austin, and she had an emotional reaction to all the investigation and allegations involving her family. What happened?
She called, apparently, the Chicago Sun-Times reporters to complain about being persecuted. As Paris noted, she remains a member of the Chicago City Council. She retains a committee post, a committee chairmanship, and so she has stayed there. But she is, of course, under heavy scrutiny. It also has come out now that the State Board of Elections has been subpoenaed by federal authorities for a, quote, criminal investigation for all of her various political committees. And she's literally crying to reporters saying, why are you going after me and why are you going after my family? After she has been a steadfast defender of nepotism, saying that it is just fine to hire many of her relatives on government payrolls or to get them hired, to arrange for that to happen because they're trustworthy, she says, despite their having gotten in trouble in many of these positions and filed bankruptcy repeatedly, again, according to media reports, including after being sued by the city for not having paid fines. Of course, that is another cold conflict of interest because aldermen are the ones who set those fines in place.
Paris, she has been a longstanding member of the City Council. She has been an influential member of the City Council. What is her status like now, given given what's going on?
Again, unchanged, although she was the head of the Budget Committee, which had a lot of a lot of clout. It had a lot of clouded positions, a lot of jobs she could dole out, and now she's on a different committee that doesn't have that kind of clout. But you know, she's the same person that, you know, cried foul when she learned that Danny Solis, the alderman, was wearing a wire. So, you know, Alderman Austin has been unabashed about, you know, this is the way things are done, and if you don't like it, tough.
Paris, let's move on to something else that's in the news, and that has to do with Mayor Lightfoot's reaction to a tweet by Ivanka Trump. Give us a backstory.
Well, that tweet by Ivanka Trump was sort of factually inaccurate, but then Mayor Lightfoot yesterday...
The tweet was?
The tweet was talking about how there was 57 wounded, or 57 shot, 7 dead near a playground in Chicago. That's not the case. That was shooting numbers throughout the city and not near a playground. But, you know, Mayor Lightfoot yesterday, she put up, you know, pictures of guns to try to illustrate the point that the gun offenders get arrested and they get right back out on the streets. And she's kind of pointing her ire toward Cook County judges that set presumably low bails. The problem here, so she's saying that this offender got a $10,000 bail, is out on the street. There are actually 2 offenders, if we go back to court records. In this case, 2 of them, they were in a car. One of them is being held without bond, and that's because he has a prior felony history. The other one got a $10,000 bond, meaning he has to pay $1,000, because he didn't have a prior felony history. And so, according to the guidelines that judges use, there was no reason to set a very high bond for this person. So this is part of this. You know, Mayor Lightfoot is increasing her rhetoric on county prosecutors and county judges as being partially responsible, she says, for this stubborn crime problem, because she says it's just they get back on the streets too easily. But now the Cook County Chief Judge, Tim Evans, he will be on this program tomorrow. They're pushing back very hard, saying, no, this is a scapegoat. There are other things that is causing this high crime problem.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Amanda, Paris, thank you both. See you next time. And we're back with Jeffrey Bear and the origin story of a Chicago neighborhood, so stay with us. As real estate development booms across certain areas of Chicago, it feels like a new neighborhood pops up every few months, full of developments promising luxury and style. This may seem like a relatively recent phenomenon, but in Chicago, the practice goes back to at least the days of the Great Fire. Here to tell us more is Jeffrey Bear in tonight's edition of Ask Jeffrey. Jeffrey, good to see you.
Always good to be here.
And we have a question from Northbrook, and the question is, what's the history of Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood, and how did it get its name?
Okay, so North Lawndale, of course, is a neighborhood on Chicago's west side, and it has struggled in recent decades with disinvestment and poverty. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. It was a very different kind of area. The name Lawndale can be traced to the early 1870s when the area was almost rural, and it had been recently annexed from neighboring Cicero. You may have noticed, Phil, a lot of towns in Chicago have these sort of pastoral, almost quaint names like Willowbrook or Park Ridge. They evoke a sort of tranquil or at least an unurban environment free of hustle and bustle of city life. So this was the same thinking behind the naming of Lawndale. North Lawndale. It was originally just called Lawndale. And in fact, the name was actually part of a marketing strategy developed by a real estate company called Millard and Decker, who purchased a section of that land with the hopes of attracting buyers to create an affluent suburb. And as you can see in this advertisement from the 1870s, Millard and Decker, they were really trying to contrast their new development with the more crowded Chicago neighborhoods. Notice how prominently nearby Douglas Park is featured in the ad.
This sounds a little different from the way developers market their city properties these days, though, isn't it?
Yeah, almost the opposite. I mean, if you think of places like been in the news, the 78, Lincoln Yards, they really play up the urban centricity instead of distancing themselves from it as buyers are moving back into cities and they're sort of looking for the excitement and convenience of city life. By the late 1800s, Millard and Decker's vision for Lawndale had really started to differ anyway from reality on the ground. As the pace of industrialization in Chicago kicked into high gear, manufacturers like the McCormick Reaper Works and later on Sears Roebuck were moving in on the borders of Lawndale. And these companies needed a labor force, and they found it in European immigrants, particularly Bohemians from present-day Czech Republic. And so many of them bought or built homes throughout this Lawndale area. And then flash forward to the early 20th century, and Jews, particularly Russian Jews, started moving into the northern part of the neighborhood from the crowded Maxwell Street area on the city's near west side. By the 1920s and 30s, North Lawndale had become this vibrant center of Jewish life in Chicago. Some estimates say at its peak, 40% of the city's Jewish population lived in this one neighborhood, which supported a large number of synagogues and Jewish organizations. And then, of course, we move on to the 1950s and the demographics change again. The neighborhood actually became one of the few places in Chicago where African Americans could actually find a place to live.
But at about this time, the whole issue of white flight came about.
That's right. All across America in the 50s and 60s, you have whites abandoning many urban neighborhoods. It's sort of racial panic fueled by the real estate industry as more African Americans moved into places like North Lawndale. While African Americans could rent in Lawndale, it was virtually impossible for them to buy the homes that they lived in because of racist practices like redlining. This map shows parts of that parts of Lawndale were in so-called redlined areas where the federal government wouldn't issue mortgages, which in turn meant that banks would not lend money to prospective buyers. So by the mid-1950s, because of racist housing policies and rampant disinvestment, much of North Lawndale by that point is really suffering from widespread poverty. And that, of course, in 1966, attracts the attention of Martin Luther King Jr., who famously moved into a dilapidated apartment in the neighborhood with his family to bring attention to the poor conditions and segregation in Chicago. There he is, upstairs, waving to the folks below. Tragically, his presence was most palpable in North Lawndale after his assassination in 1968, which set off several days of widespread rioting and violence. At least 9 people died, many homes and businesses were destroyed. Today, the impact of the riots is still visible as North Lawndale struggles to have vacant lots, disinvestment, and that ongoing legacy of segregation. But it's also home to numerous community groups and organizations who work as advocates for the neighborhood and for its residents. Some of them helped oversee construction of a new apartment building in 2011 at 16th and Hamlin, where Martin Luther King lived in 1966. It's known as the Dr. King Legacy Apartments. The affordable units are a tribute to King's struggle for civil rights here in Chicago. And then this one, just last month, the North Lawndale Employment Network announced an expansion into a new campus in the neighborhood. This is a group that offers job training and placement for people returning from incarceration or just who don't have a high school diploma, among other disadvantages. And with the expansion, they're hoping to double the number of clients they serve to 5,000 people.
Jeffrey, thank you. Good history lesson.
Great to be here.
And you can visit our website for more information on Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood and to submit your question to Jeffrey Bear. Many might know the name Chicago comes from a word spoken by American Indian tribes. Of course, legend has it that it loosely translates to stinky onions. The city is also home to the largest population of Native Americans in the Midwest. Despite this fact, members of Chicago's American Indian community say stereotypes place them in the past instead of in the present. But a new garden aims to challenge those stereotypes. Paris Schutz recently brought us this story, and here is another look.
Amidst the traffic and noise in Chicago's North Side Albany Park neighborhood, there's a new urban garden. But it's more than just a garden for some residents.
It's became a beacon for Native people who are looking for healing. It's important to have this space here within the city of Chicago because a lot of people have lost their connection to the land.
The garden sits on the corner of Pulaski Road and Wilson Avenue and was created by the American Indian Center and the Chi Nations Youth Council in partnership with the city. Its purpose is twofold: to serve as a healing space for Chicago's Native community and as a teaching and learning hub for non-Native people.
We want everybody in Chicago to be able to come to this garden and learn about Native people, and not just Native people, but the land that is Chicago.
The garden was officially established in November 2018 through a ceremonial land acknowledgement. That's an expression of gratitude used by many tribal communities, and it recognizes Native people as traditional stewards over a plot of land. The ceremony for the First Nations garden came on the heels of the City Council passing a resolution brought forward by Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, whose ward is home to the garden. The resolution was drafted to recognize Chicago as an indigenous landscape. It calls for acknowledging that the city sits on the ancestral homeland of dozens of tribes, and that the city is currently home to more than 75,000 American Indians, known as urban Indians.
Oftentimes when we think about the history of the United States, we tell ourselves a story of either a land that was devoid of habitation or a land that was cleared for habitation as settlers and Europeans colonized the land. But the reality is that Native people have been in the Chicagoland area for thousands of years, and they continue to be here with a vibrant culture.
Different elements of the garden represent that culture, taken from traditions and customs of more than 100 tribes in the city. Organizers say the recently planted sunflowers help rid the soil of toxins that come from urban settings. A fire pit serves as a gathering space for the community. And traditional Native structures like the wigwam and teepee host Native activities and storytelling all year long.
So many times we are forgotten, we are left out of history, and we're just glossed over. And so having an actual physical space to build things like a longhouse, to build a garden, to grow our traditional plants helps reduce that element of invisibility and helps bring more light and more education to the Native people that call this city home, as well as our important issues that we're facing as a group within the city.
Some of those issues are detailed in a new report out of the University of Illinois at Chicago's Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. It finds that half of Chicago's Native Americans are rent-burdened. The wage increase associated with a college degree is lower for Native Americans than for all other race groups in Chicago. And women's rates of incarceration in Illinois are higher for Native Americans than for women in all other racial and ethnic groups.
A primary purpose is also just to shed light on the fact that there is a Native community here in Chicago, and to bring attention to some of the challenges that the community faces.
But in addition to recognizing those struggles, Walden says it's important to remember what Native people bring to the table. And she says the First Nations Garden is a prime example of just that.
This is a really great example of youth in the community reclaiming a space of land and indigenizing it. Even just to drive by and see traditional structures in that space in a city is pretty unique.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Paris Schutz.
Organizers with the garden say they've added new plants since the story first aired, and they're working to add a new cover to the wigwam so they can conduct storytelling sessions in the fall. For those interested in getting involved with the First Nations Garden, there are community work days every Sunday, rain or shine. You can find more details on our website. And that's our show for this Wednesday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.